The pervasive aroma of bleach was the very first sensation that awakened her each dawn, and the last scent to accompany her into slumber. Lara's knuckles bore the raw testament to endless toil, and a persistent, dull throb had taken root in the lower regions of her back, a constant companion in a life defined by ceaseless domestic duties. She meticulously polished the flagstones of the expansive great hall belonging to the Silver Moon Pack, her gaze fixed downward, her entire universe confined to a circular patch of damp, gray stone. In truth, her entire existence felt like a perpetually damp, gray stone circle. She found solace in this limited perspective. To look up might reveal them, and she harbored no desire for them to perceive her. Not yet. The boisterous sounds of merriment and confident pronouncements drifted in from the training grounds just beyond. These were the sounds of the pack's warriors, the echoes of their vitality, their power, their very aliveness. A painful, involuntary flutter, like a trapped bird desperately beating against her ribs, stirred within her chest. Amongst those voices, she recognized his, a deeper, richer resonance than the others. Kyle, the pack's second in command, her destined but distant partner. Despite her strongest efforts, the vivid image of him refused to depart from her thoughts. The way his dark hair would fall across his forehead when he was absorbed in a task, the sheer power in the set of his shoulders, the unhesitating confidence in his gait. He embodied everything she was not, strong, acknowledged, esteemed. She, conversely, was the orphaned Omega, the one relegated to cleaning up the disarray that others left behind. Perhaps it was a decree of destiny that forged such a stark disparity between them, a cruel, celestial jest. With every beat of her heart, she felt the subtle, invisible thrum of the mate bond resonating between them, a connection that seemed to exist solely within her awareness. To him, she was merely another shadow, diligently buffing the floors. Yet a fragile ember of hope, both warm and perilous, began to glow within her. What if he remained unaware? How could he possibly know? She had never mustered the courage to articulate her feelings. The mere prospect was paralyzing, akin to plunging from the highest precipice into an uncharted sea. But the alternative, a lifetime steeped in this profound, aching solitude, was a far more daunting prospect. Before she could fully process this thought, two warriors strode past, their mud-caked boots leaving dark streaks across her freshly cleaned floor. They didn't even spare her a cursory glance, as if she were merely an indistinguishable fixture of the castle's architecture, entirely unseen. A chilling weight settled in her chest, the all-too-familiar sensation of absolute invisibility. Deep within her, she grasped the stark reality of her situation. This was her allotted existence. Day in and day out, she faced a stark choice: either surrender to this life of being overlooked, unheard, and untouched, or embark on the most audacious risk of her existence. She concluded her task, her movements stiff, her mind a tempest of conflicting thoughts. That evening, she stood before the small, fractured-looking glass in her meager chamber, confronting the reflection of a young woman with wide, frightened eyes and a spirit worn thin by hardship. However, tonight, an additional element resided there, a nascent spark of determination. She had to know. One way or another, by morning, she would confide in him tomorrow. This singular resolution was a minuscule flicker of light against the vast darkness of her world. As dawn broke, the pack house buzzed, with an anxious energy that bore no relation to her own. Lira moved through the kitchens, her hands occupied with the preparation of the morning repast, yet her thoughts were miles away, meticulously rehearsing the words she intended to speak to Kyle. Her stomach churned, a coiled nest of agitated serpents. As she conveyed a platter laden with freshly baked bread into the dining hall, their voices assailed her, sharp, glittering, and steeped in malice. A trio of high-ranking she-wolves, their coats lustrous and their postures radiating an air of supreme arrogance, were assembled near the hearth. Their conversation focused on him. "Kyle has been intensifying his training regimen more than ever before," declared a tall she-wolf named Lira. The alpha of the Crimson Fang Pack is actively seeking a formidable alliance. His daughter, you know, remains unwed. Another, Vexia, interjected, with a laugh that sounded like the splintering of glass. An alliance with the Crimson Fangs would elevate us to the preeminent pack in this territory. Kyle requires a mate possessing both strength and social standing, someone capable of solidifying his position. The third wolf chimed in with a sigh. Can you even conceive of him being paired with some common nobody? A weak mate would act as an anchor, dragging him down. It would be an absolute disgrace. Elra froze just within the threshold of the doorway. The substantial tray in her hand suddenly felt as though it weighed 1,000 pounds, and her breath hitched in her throat. Their pronouncements were not mere idle gossip. They constituted a direct assault upon the fragile tendril of hope she had so painstakingly cultivated. To compound her distress, they were painting a stark picture of a world where destiny was subordinate to sheer power. The fates may be benevolent, but they are not dim-witted, Vexia added, a smirk gracing her lips. They would never juxtapose a lion with a mouse. The sound of their laughter, sharp and derisive, followed her. It wasn't aimed directly at her, not truly, as they were unaware of her presence. Nevertheless, it pierced her as effectively as any venomous dart striking her heart. The idyllic scenario she had envisioned, a world where a fated bond sufficed, where affection could surmount any chasm, disintegrated into dust. She found herself grappling with a dual terror, the prospect of Kyle's rejection, or the chilling possibility that these she-wolves were indeed correct. Without conscious thought, she retreated, melting into the shadowed recesses of the corridor before they could notice her. The warm bread in her hands had turned cold. Her resolve, once a steady, nascent flame, now flickered erratically amidst a tempest of doubt and fear. Her initial intention to simply voice her feelings now seemed naive, almost childlike. A desperate, consuming need to prove them wrong ignited within her. She had to demonstrate to them, and to him, that she was far more than a mere mouse. She had to transcend their limited perception of her. This was no longer solely about hope. It had transformed into a fight for survival. Silence. That was the predominant sensation King Rowan registered every single day. The stillness within his throne room was profound, a palpable entity that seemed to press in from all directions. It was the silence that emanated from absolute power, the silence of profound isolation, the silence of a man elevated so far above his peers that their voices could no longer reach him. The throne itself was frigid, hewn from the very heart of a mountain, and it evoked the sensation of an icy cage rather than a seat of authority. He occupied it, the familiar weight of his crown a constant pressure on his brow, absorbing the dispatches from his master of spies. His dominion was vast, his reign unquestioned, yet a subtle decay festered at the fringes of his territories. The incursions by rogue elements are becoming increasingly coordinated, Your Majesty, the spy master reported, his voice a low murmur within the cavernous hall. They are probing our defenses, growing ever bolder. The latest intelligence from the Silver Moon Pack is indeed troubling. Their beta is formidable, but their alpha appears to be succumbing to complacency. The pack exhibits clear signs of internal vulnerability. Rowan's jaw tightened. He recognized weakness as a contagion, a force that inevitably spread. And what is their alpha's response to this escalating threat? He assures us, sire, that he has the situation well in hand. Rowan's golden eyes, mirroring the hue of a wolf's gaze in the moonlight, narrowed. An assurance from a compromised alpha held no more value than the fleeting breath used to utter it. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he bade the spymaster depart. The man bowed and retreated, his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Left to his own devices, Rowan rose and walked towards the immense window that offered a panoramic view of his capital city, his people, his solemn responsibility. He had navigated the treacherous currents of war, orchestrated intricate diplomatic accords, and forged a legacy of strength destined to endure for millennia. Moreover, he had accomplished all of this in solitude, To be perfectly honest, a part of him had always harbored a peculiar sense of emptiness, a void where something significant ought to have resided. The elders often spoke of the King's Mark, a fabled bond that was prophesied to ignite when an Alpha King finally encountered his true consort, his queen. It was a charming narrative, a bedtime story spun for solitary monarchs to instill a semblance of hope. He had long since abandoned any belief in such tales. Love was an indulgence, and destiny a capricious force. His soul mate was his sworn duty. Yet, a peculiar restlessness stirred within him, a primal dissatisfaction he couldn't quite define. The mere thought of the Silver Moon pack, of a pack slowly decaying from within, grated on his very soul. It represented a loose thread in the immaculate tapestry of his kingdom, and he felt an immediate, undeniable compulsion to unravel it. Why did the vulnerability of this single pack disturb him so profoundly? Was it merely the potential threat to his borders? Or was it something more? A faint whisper on the wind, just beyond his comprehension. He turned back towards the vacant throne room, the silence roaring in his ears. An idea, sharp and decisive, pierced through the haze of his contemplations. This was a matter that demanded more than a mere courier. It required a personal intervention. It necessitated the presence of the king himself. In that instant, his course of action became unequivocally clear. His voice, directed at the empty air, lacked volume but carried the unyielding force of command, a sound intended to galvanize armies. He strode towards the grand doors and flung them open, his voice echoing down the long corridor to the guards standing vigil. "Prepare the royal retinue. We ride for Silver Moon at dawn." There he stood. Kyle occupied the center of the training yard, his back glistening with exertion, engaged in jovial banter with a group of his warrior comrades. Sunlight caught the highlights in his dark hair, and he presented an image perfectly befitting the powerful beta he was destined to be. For a fleeting moment, Lira's courage wavered, a timid bird fluttering in her throat. The harsh pronouncements of the she-wolves from earlier that day replayed in her mind, a cacophony of doubt and disdain. However, she then recalled the suffocating loneliness of her cramped quarters, the stinging humiliation of being invisible. That pain surpassed any fear she currently felt. Her body moved with an instinctual drive, propelling her from the shadows and into the bright expanse of the yard. The warriors' laughter ceased as she approached, their gazes falling upon her with a mixture of bewilderment and casual dismissal. She felt the scrutiny of 100 pairs of eyes, yet her focus remained solely on him. Her heart pounded with such intensity that she was certain the entire world could perceive its frantic rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of her life teetering on the brink of irrevocable change. She halted a few paces away from him, her hands twisting nervously in the worn fibers of her tunic. "Kyle." Her voice emerged as a mere whisper, fragile and thin. She cleared her throat and attempted again, injecting more resolve into her tone. "Beta Kyle, may I have a word with you?" He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced at his companions. "The little Omega wishes to converse. What is it you require?" Her cheeks flushed with mortification, but she pressed onward. This was the moment. It's about us," she stammered, the words feeling awkward and foolish on her tongue. "There's a bond. The fates. They've chosen us. You and me. We're mates." As the silence stretched, it became a tangible presence, pressing in on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. Kyle's smirk dissolved, replaced by an expression of utter disbelief. His eyes swept over her, from her scuffed footwear to her unremarkable face. It was a gaze that stripped her bare, assessed her worth, and found her wanting. And then he laughed. It was not a soft chuckle, but a loud, cruel, echoing sound that shattered the silence and tore her world asunder. He threw his head back and roared, his companions joining in. Their collective laughter descended upon her like a tidal wave of humiliation. "You!" Kyle finally gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You are my mate, an Omega." He spat the word as if it were venom. The fates must have been inebriated. I reject you. I, Kyle, Beta of the Silver Moon Pack, reject you. The air departed her lungs in a silent whoosh, as if his words had delivered a physical blow. The world narrowed to a dizzying pinpoint of light. The sounds of their laughter receded into a dull roar in her ears. His words, his laughter, were not merely a rejection, they were an execution. Her world imploded. Before she could react, before she could even formulate a thought, her legs were already moving. Without conscious direction, she was running, fleeing the training yard as if pursued by infernal hounds. Their mocking laughter pursued her, chasing her, branding her, with a shame so profound it felt as though it might extinguish her very life. She did not cease her flight until the dense, dark woods enveloped her completely, at which point she collapsed at the base of an ancient oak. The sound of her own heartbroken sobs was the sole auditory presence in the world. Time seemed to cease its passage, or perhaps it blurred into an indistinguishable rush. Lira had no way of knowing. She was curled into a tight ball, her body racked with grief, the forest floor damp and cold beneath her. The sun began its descent, painting the sky with hues of blood and bruises, but she remained oblivious to the spectacle. All she could perceive was the expression on Kyle's face. All she could hear was the lingering echo of that devastating laughter. As dusk deepened its embrace on the woods, a new, chilling sensation began to creep across her skin. A primal fear. The forest, once her sole refuge, now seemed fraught with menace. Shadows danced between the trees, contorting into sinister shapes. Her wolf, a creature so timid it rarely stirred, now paced restlessly beneath her skin, whimpering in terror. Danger! Suddenly a twig snapped nearby. Lira's head snapped up, her sobs catching in her throat. Her heart leaped. She was not alone. She strained her ears, attempting to discern sounds beyond the frantic pounding of her own pulse. A low, guttural snarl sliced through the night. Cold, sharp panic seized her. Rogues! She could detect their presence now. The foul stench of blood, matted fur, and a desperate, lawless hunger. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough bark of the oak, endeavoring to diminish her form, to become invisible once more. But it was too late. Gleaming eyes materialized in the gloom. One pair, then two, then four. They were closing in on her. A large, scarred wolf with mangy fur and wild yellow eyes stepped forward, its lips peeling back to reveal rows of stained, wicked teeth. It perceived her for what she was, weak, isolated, prey. Deep within her, she understood the truth. This was it. This was the culmination of her story, rejected and alone, to be torn asunder in the darkness. The lead rogue lunged, a blur of matted fur and snapping jaws. Her voice was gone, a scream trapped within her throat. She raised her arms instinctively to shield her face, bracing for the searing agony of teeth tearing into her flesh, but the anticipated pain never arrived. Instead, there was a sound akin to thunder, a fleeting vision of black motion, and a sickening crunch. The rogue poised to strike her was hurled sideways, its body impacting a tree with a final, broken whimper. Lira lowered her arms, her eyes wide with stunned disbelief. A massive black wolf now stood between her and the other rogues, its form a solid wall of muscle. Its fur was the hue of a starless night sky, its silver-tipped hairs shimmering like frost beneath the faint moonlight. It turned its head slightly, and its eyes met hers. They were gold, not the ordinary yellow of a wolf, but a deep, molten gold that burned with a fierce, terrifying intelligence. In that singular moment, the world seemed to contract, focusing solely on the two of them. It was as if destiny itself demanded this encounter. This was no ordinary wolf. This was something far more profound. Before either could speak or even draw breath, the other rogues, emboldened by their numerical advantage, charged. Her protector did not hesitate. It met their assault with a roar that transcended mere animalistic sound, a declaration of absolute dominance, a promise of annihilation. Rowan moved like a spectral harbinger of death through the ensuing chaos. The rogue assault was pathetic, utterly disorganized, a stark testament to the Silver Moon Pack's pervasive weakness. His royal guard was more than capable of handling the situation, yet he fought alongside them. His claws and teeth were a blur of silver and crimson. Battle was a pure, unfeeling endeavor. There was no room for thought, only instinct, no space for emotion, only the grim satisfaction of restoring order. He was a king. This was his charge. He ripped the throat out of one rogue and was already turning towards the next. And then he saw her, as if drawn by an invisible tether. His gaze was drawn to a small clearing at the edge of the woods, a diminutive omega she-wolf cornered against a tree. Her face was streaked with tears. Terror was etched into every fiber of her being. She was nothing, a nobody, another casualty in a meaningless skirmish. So why, then, could he not tear his eyes away? The instant their eyes met, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The clamor of battle, the screams, the snarls, all faded into a distant hum. A bolt of lightning shot down his spine, intensely hot and fierce, and a fire erupted across his skin. An ancient power, dormant for a millennium, was awakening. The king's mark, the legend, the fairy tale, it was real. A single word burned into his mind, branded onto his very soul. Mine. Without conscious thought, his body moved. No longer a king leading a charge, but a primal male claiming his mate. He traversed the distance between them in a series of powerful, grounded strides. His world narrowed until she was the sole point of focus. He reached her just as the last of the rogues launched its final attack. He did not merely kill it, he annihilated it, his fury a cold, precise storm. He turned back to her, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in harsh pants. She was gazing up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and profound awe. She was so small, so fragile, and she was his. The magic of the mark surged through him, demanding a physical claim. It was not a choice, it was an overwhelming compulsion, as undeniable as the dawn. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently tilted her chin upward. As his thumb brushed against the soft skin of her throat, the mark flared to life. A glowing, intricate silver crest materialized on her skin, a swirling pattern of a wolf entwined with a crown, pulsing with a soft, ethereal luminescence. It was a brand, a claim, a declaration to the entire world. A stunned gasp emanated from behind him. Rowan turned, his golden eyes blazing, his arm instinctively moving to shield LRA. Kyle, the Pax Beta, stood there, his face a mask of utter shock and horrified disbelief, his gaze fixed on the luminous mark adorning LRA's throat. Rowan paid the Beta no mind. He cared not for the pack, nor for the ongoing conflict. In that moment, his sole concern was the trembling woman behind him. Before any words could escape his lips, a low, possessive growl rumbled from his chest. It was a sound that promised a world of agony to anyone who dared to even contemplate harming her. It was a sound that reverberated through the sudden, deathly silence of the forest, the sound of a king who had just discovered his queen. When her eyes fluttered open, it was not the acrid scent of bleach that greeted her, but the rich, clean aroma of cedar and aged leather, and it was this unexpected softness that truly instilled a sense of dread. Lira found herself reclining on a mountain of furs, so sumptuously plush that she felt as though she were sinking into a cloud. A fire crackled softly in a nearby brazier, casting dancing shadows across the walls of a colossal tent. This was unmistakably a king's tent, furnished with dark wood pieces and iron-bound chests. Her worn, threadbare tunic had been replaced by a simple yet exquisitely soft linen shift. Her entire world had been upended, but her body registered only one singular sensation: the peculiar tingling warmth on her throat. As if drawn by an unseen force, her gaze found a shimmering silver mirror propped against a chest. She pushed herself upright, the furs cascading away, and stumbled towards it. Her legs felt weak, unsteady, and then she saw it. There, imprinted upon her skin, was the king's mark. It was not a crude brand, but an intricate, swirling crest depicting a wolf's head encircled by a crown, glowing with a gentle silver light. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet it felt like a cage, a brand, an irrefutable claim. She felt like a trapped creature, a prize secured in a battle she had never desired to participate in, for the sheer opulence was more suffocating than any poverty she had ever endured. Her breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was he? Why had he done this? As if summoned by her rising fear, the tent flap parted and he entered, the king. He filled the space, his presence so immense it seemed to draw all the air from the tent. He was even more imposing than he had appeared in the forest, a monolith of quiet, controlled power. He had changed into a simple leather tunic, but it did little to conceal the raw strength evident in his shoulders and chest. His golden eyes, the color of ancient, molten treasure, met hers. "You are safe here," he stated. His voice was a low, rumbling sound, reminiscent of rocks shifting deep within the earth. It was not intentionally menacing, but it was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Safe? She had never felt so utterly unsafe in her entire life. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to conceal herself, to revert to being the invisible girl once more. She took a hesitant step backward, her bare feet cold against the thick rug. He took a single step forward. "I am Rowan. You need not be afraid." She was apprehensive because Cale had also wielded considerable influence, and his power had been a tool he used to subjugate her. Before she could intervene, her body reacted on instinct as he lifted a hand, not to strike, but possibly to offer solace. She recoiled sharply, shutting her eyes tight, anticipating a blow that never materialized. The subsequent quiet was heavy, saturated with his bewilderment and her mortification. Back within his own quarters, the silence felt like a deafening denunciation. Rowan gazed into his fire, but all he perceived was the raw, unadulterated terror in her eyes. She had regarded him as if he were a monstrosity, he who had just preserved her existence, he who was her destined partner, a connection intended to be the most revered entity in their society. He was a sovereign, a combatant, a commander of legions. Yet a single involuntary flinch from a diminutive Omega she-wolf had left him feeling utterly bereft of strength. He was perplexed, having adhered scrupulously to their customs and their innate impulses, and yet everything had gone so dreadfully awry. He required comprehension. "Valerius," he commanded. Moments later, the tent flap parted, admitting his most steadfast captain. A weathered elder wolf with a scarred visage and eyes that had borne witness to countless conflicts. Valerius inclined his head. "Your Majesty, the Omega," Rowan stated, his voice strained. "Her designation is Elra. Ascertain all particulars. I wish to know her solitary presence in those woodlands. I wish to know why she regards me as her executioner." Valerius offered a single nod and vanished. He returned in less than an hour, his countenance somber. He stood before the monarch and spoke, his words direct and devoid of any gentleness. "Her progenitors perished in the preceding rogue skirmish. She possesses no other kin. This morning she approached the pack beta, a wolf named Cale." Rowan's gaze narrowed. "Proceed." She divulged her mate bond to him in the presence of the entire training grounds. A chilling constriction formed in Rowan's abdomen. "And the beta, Your Majesty?" Valerius hesitated, his jaw working. He chuckled. He proclaimed her insignificant, and then he publicly disavowed her. The entirety of the pack joined in the amusement. She fled into the forest to conceal herself. That is where the renegades discovered her. A wrath so frigid, so absolute, it threatened to fracture his kingly composure, enveloped Rowan. The atmosphere within the tent grew dense, charged with his silent, homicidal fury. He had laughed before the pack. He had seized her heart, the most delicate and hopeful fragment of her being, and he had shattered it for sport. In that instant, Rowan grasped the truth. Lira did not fear him. She feared his might. She was fearful because the last potent male she had entrusted with her spirit had employed that might to humiliate and dismantle her. And Rowan, with his diadem and his army and his overwhelming aura of authority, was the most formidable male she had ever encountered. To her, he must have appeared as the ultimate peril. He was incensed because Cale had dared to inflict harm upon what was his, what was cherished. But even more grievously, he now understood that his greatest advantage, his fortitude, was precisely what stood between him and his mate. He could not compel her to place her trust in him. He could not force her to recuperate. What ensued was a resolution born not of strategic calculation, but of a primal protective instinct he was only beginning to comprehend. He could not mend her injuries here, not in the very place that had inflicted them. He would escort her homeward, to the capital, to his stronghold. There, he could shield her from the world, while he devised a method to dismantle the barriers surrounding her heart. The passage to the capital was a blur of movement and apprehension. Lira traveled in a closed conveyance, the silken upholstery feeling alien and discordant. She felt akin to a pilfered possession, a spoil of war being conveyed to the victor's citadel. And what a citadel it was! It was more than a mere fortress. It was a mountain sculpted into a bastion, adorned with soaring turrets that seemed to pierce the clouds and ramparts so immense they rendered her insignificant, like an insect. Within its confines, her existence became a disorienting maelstrom of attendants, adorning her in robes of unimaginable softness, of corridors so vast their termini dissolved into shadow, of the perpetual, unsettling sensation of being observed. She felt like an interloper, a common field mouse bedecked in the glittering plumage of a songbird. For deep within, she still felt like the insignificant Omega from the Silver Moon Pack. Days later, Rowan decreed that she was to be presented to the court. She stood beside his dais in the grand assembly hall, a cavernous chamber teeming with hundreds of the realm's most influential wolves. The weight of their gazes was a palpable pressure, and she could sense their judgment, their curiosity, their disdain. The air, thick with the aroma of beeswax and costly perfume, felt oppressive to inhale. As Rowan spoke, his voice resonating with command, a she-wolf glided towards them. She was of breathtaking beauty, clad in deep sapphire velvet, with eyes the hue of ice and a smile that never reached them. "Your Majesty," she purred, inclining her head slightly towards Rowan before directing her frigid gaze upon Lira. "We are all quite taken aback by your selection. A new queen is an occasion of profound significance." Lira could only nod, her throat too constricted for speech. The she-wolf's smile widened, yet it was as sharp as the edge of a blade. She leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper, audible to all within earshot. "An Omega Queen," she declared, her tone laced with insincere sweetness. "How quaint. I trust you will not be overly daunted by your responsibilities." The words, though elegantly phrased, were a stinging insult. They struck her with the same force as Cale's laughter. The world began to dim at its periphery, much as it had in the courtyard. Her meticulously crafted composure fractured, and the familiar old shame flooded her being, cold and paralyzing. She froze, incapable of speech, incapable of breath. She was on the verge of collapse, but then something warm and solid rested upon the small of her back. Rowan. He uttered not a word, but he had moved to stand a little closer, his hand a steadfast, grounding presence. He did not look at Lira. Instead, his molten gold eyes fixed upon the exquisite she-wolf. He remained silent. He did not need to speak. The expression in his eyes was so frigid, so imbued with absolute authority and the silent promise of devastating repercussions, that the she-wolf's smile faltered. The color drained from her face, and with a stammered apology, she practically fled, dissolving back into the throng. In the ensuing stillness, Rowan's hand remained upon her back, an unyielding, silent bulwark. It did not mend the wound inflicted by the she-wolf's pronouncements, but for the first time since she had awakened in his tent, she experienced a sentiment other than fear. A minute, delicate flicker of something else. He was her captor, her sovereign, the source of her dread, but he was also her protector, and she was uncertain which prospect filled her with greater trepidation. The fragile edifice he was endeavoring to construct around Lira felt akin to a structure of glass, with Cale poised outside, gathering stones. Rowan stood before an expansive map of the territories, his spymaster's words echoing in the taut silence of the war chamber. The situation was more dire than he had initially assessed, much more so. "He is not merely lamenting a lost mate, Your Majesty," Valerius reported, his voice grim. "He is distorting the narrative. To exacerbate matters, he is portraying you as a despotic king who abducted a destined beta's companion out of base desire. He alleges that the king's mark was a stratagem, a sorcery you employed to legitimize your claim." Rowan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles stark white. The sheer audacity of the fabrication was astounding. Yet he recognized its cunning, its perilous nature, as it preyed upon the anxieties of the lesser packs, their simmering resentment of a monarch so powerful as to seemingly bend destiny to his will. "And that is not all," Valerius continued, his gaze dark. "He is leveraging Lira's standing against her. He is disseminating rumors that you have disgraced the throne by selecting an Omega, that an Omega is incapable of assuming the role of queen, and that her inherent weakness will precipitate our collective downfall." A low growl rumbled in Rowan's chest, a sound of unadulterated, volcanic fury. Each word was a deliberate affront, an assault aimed not solely at him, but directly at Lira. Cale was systematically reconstructing the very prison of worthlessness from which she was just beginning to extricate herself. His objective was not merely to undermine a king, it was to shatter a queen. "The Silver Moon Pack is fractured," Valerius concluded. "Some remain loyal to you, but a significant number are heeding Cale's pronouncements. His words are poison, and they are spreading." Rowan turned from the map, his golden eyes ablaze with a cold fire. His initial impulse was to ride forth, to drag Cale back in chains and make a public spectacle of him, but he could not. More than that, he knew that resorting to brute force would only validate Cale's assertions. It would cast him in the very light of the tyrant Cale purported him to be. No, this was not a conflict to be resolved with tooth and claw. This was a war for the hearts of his people, and to prevail, they needed to perceive Lira not as a captive Omega, but as the queen she was destined to be. In that instant, he comprehended his course of action. He had to cease shielding her from the world, and commence revealing the truth of her own inherent strength. That evening, Rowan appeared in her chambers. A newfound urgency flickered in his eyes, a seriousness that caused her pulse to quicken with a blend of apprehension and curiosity. He did not speak of courtly matters or political machinations. Instead, he extended his hand. "There is something I must show you," he said, his voice low and earnest. Her heart skipped a beat. Without deliberation, she placed her hand in his. His was warm and firm, his calloused fingers encircling hers, sending a jolt of surprising warmth through her. He led her not towards the opulent halls, but down a winding stone staircase she had never before encountered. Descending deep into the castle's foundations, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else, something wild and imbued with magic. They emerged into a breathtaking grotto, a concealed sanctuary nestled within the mountain's core. A canopy of luminescent moss adorned the ceiling, casting a soft, blue-green radiance upon everything. In the center of the grotto, a spring bubbled forth from the ground. Its waters were so crystalline they resembled liquid moonlight. This place felt alive. It hummed with a quiet, ancient power. "This is the Heartwood," Rowan stated, his voice reverent, "the wellspring of the kingdom's magic. It is said that the first Alpha King planted a seed here, and from it, this fortress blossomed." Lira gazed, utterly captivated. It was the most magnificent place she had ever beheld. "I brought you here to illuminate the truth of the mark," he continued, turning to face her. The effulgence emanating from the Heartwood spring illuminated his countenance, softening the stern lines of his regal authority, revealing the man beneath. "It is not a brand of ownership, Lira. It is a conduit, a bond of shared strength, of a shared soul." Before she could respond, he gently reached out and placed his palm over the king's mark on her throat. As if destiny demanded it, the moment his skin touched hers, the heartwood spring erupted in a silent pulse of brilliant light. A surge of raw power, warm and overwhelming, coursed through her. The world dissolved. She was no longer in the grotto. She found herself standing in a vast, deserted throne room. The silence was a crushing weight. She felt a loneliness so profound, so absolute, it was a physical ache in her chest. Decades of solitude, of duty, devoid of companionship, of being a king, but never truly a man. It washed over her, a tidal wave of his sorrow, his isolation. Simultaneously, the vision shifted. Suddenly, she was in a training yard, the sun beating down relentlessly, the air filled with cruel, echoing laughter. She felt the shame, the soul-shattering agony of rejection so vividly it was as if it were happening anew. But this time, it was not her pain she was experiencing. It was his. He was feeling what she had felt. Between one breath and the next, the vision shattered, leaving them both gasping in the soft luminescence of the heartwood. They staggered back from each other, their chests heaving. Her world tilted precariously. The space between them crackled with a new, terrifying, and beautiful understanding. He was not merely a king who had claimed her. He was a soul who had experienced her deepest wound as his own. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of something entirely different. She looked at him, truly beholding the man behind the crown for the very first time. Her voice trembled. "You were alone, too." Her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge constructed between them in the wake of the magic. "You were alone, too." It was not a question, but a declaration of fact, a statement of shared experience that fractured the armor he had worn around his heart for a century. The connection had irrevocably altered everything. Upon their return to the upper echelons of the castle, the atmosphere between them had transformed. The apprehension in her eyes had been supplanted by a quiet, contemplative empathy, and the frustration that had consumed his heart had given way to a fierce, deeply ingrained imperative to protect not merely her physical being, but the delicate, healing fragments of her soul. Yet their newfound serenity was akin to a delicate, sun-warmed bloom, and a serpent was already slithering through the grass. He was in his study late the following night when Valerius entered, his visage etched with a stony grimness. He spoke not a word. He simply placed a small, folded piece of parchment upon Rowan's desk. It was sealed with the emblem of a lesser house, a pathetic attempt at concealment. "It was being smuggled to the Queen's chambers," Valerius stated, his voice tight with suppressed fury. Rowan's blood ran cold. He picked it up, the paper feeling unnaturally slick beneath his fingers. He broke the seal. The handwriting was Cale's, and the words were pure venom. "My dearest LRA, I observe the king adorning you in fine silks. But does he perceive the omega shivering beneath them? A gilded cage remains a cage. He parades you like a trophy, a symbol of his might, but a crown cannot alter your inherent nature. Deep down, you know the truth. You do not belong there. Do you not yearn for home? Do you not long for the sky that does not judge you? Return, little mouse. Return before he tires of his new plaything and discards you. I was a fool. I comprehend that now. Allow me to rectify my error. Yours, Cale." A growl rose in his throat, a sound distinctly inhuman. His vision tunneled, a crimson haze of pure, homicidal rage descending upon him. He yearned to hunt Cale down and wrench the deceitful, manipulative words from his very throat. He wished to incinerate the note, to pretend it had never existed, to shield Lira from its insidious influence. But then, the memory of the heartwood flooded back. The palpable sensation of her pain, sharp and acutely real. To conceal this from her now would constitute a betrayal of the trust they had so recently forged. It would be to treat her as the fragile, shattered entity Cale accused her of being. It would reduce him to no more than a jailer. He had to place his faith in her. He had to believe that the woman who had confronted his loneliness without faltering possessed the fortitude to confront the specter of her past. The tension dissipated. His decision was made. He He stood, the poisoned parchment clutched tightly in his fist. With every step he took towards her chambers, his heart pounded against his ribs. This was a greater trial than any battlefield engagement. He was about to bestow upon his queen the very instrument designed for her destruction. And he could only offer a silent prayer that the bond between them was sufficiently robust to withstand the venom. Sleep had eluded her. The memory of the heartwood, the sensation of Rowan's solitude, the echo of her own anguish resonating within his soul played on repeat in her mind. It had altered everything. The fear she had harbored towards him had been supplanted by something far more intricate, something fragile and terrifyingly real. She was pacing the plush rug in her chambers when a soft scratching sound emanated from her balcony door. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was not the sound of a guard. It was furtive, clandestine. Before she could call for assistance, a small dark shape scurried across the stone and deposited a sealed parchment at her feet before vanishing back into the night. A trained raven. Her blood ran cold. She knew with a chilling certainty that permeated her very bones who it was from. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it. Cale's scent clung to the paper, a phantom from a life that felt like 1,000 years ago. Her initial impulse was to incinerate it, to feign its non-existence. The Lira of old, the girl who fled from pain, screamed within her to conceal it. But then she recalled Rowan's eyes in the luminous grotto. She remembered the shared vulnerability, the unspoken pledge. To conceal this would be a betrayal of that fragile trust. It would signify that Cale's poisonous words still held sway over her. It would confirm his assertion that she remained merely a trembling omega beneath the silk. No. As the silence stretched, a new strength, as hard and clear as diamond, solidified within her chest. She would not permit him to shatter what she was constructing here. She would not allow him to transform her into a keeper of secrets. Without another word to herself, she strode from her room, the missive clutched in her hand like a weapon. She found Rowan in the corridor, approaching her chambers, his countenance a mask of grim resolution. He held an identical piece of parchment. He stopped upon seeing her, his golden eyes widening in astonishment as he gazed from the note in his hand to the one she held. Before he could speak, she extended it to him. Her hand was shaking, but her voice was steady. "He sent this as well," she stated simply. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. This was her choice, her commitment. "He believes I am still the girl who fled weeping into the woods." She inhaled deeply, meeting his intense gaze without faltering. "He is mistaken." In that moment, she was not merely an omega claimed by a king. She was a woman charting her own destiny, and she was choosing him. She had crossed a threshold within her own heart, and there was no turning back. Rowan's gaze lingered on the parchment in her hand, then returned to her face. He discerned the tremor in her fingers, but he also perceived the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She had not concealed it. She had not allowed the poison to infiltrate her being. She had confronted the serpent and brought it directly to him. A tidal wave of emotion surged through him. A fierce, possessive pride so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. This was not the frightened girl he had discovered in the woods. This was a queen. His queen. He gently took the note from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. He now held both of Cale's pathetic little daggers. Instead of diminishing Lira, they had served only to equip her with a strength she had not realized she possessed. And Cale, in his hubris, had inadvertently provided Rowan with the very element he most desperately needed, justification. "He will never touch you again," Rowan declared, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The words were not merely a promise. They were a vow sealed in the cold fire of his wrath. He turned, his mind clear, his purpose absolute. The era of covert protection had concluded. The time for reacting to Cale's puerile games was over. It was imperative to remind the world of the consequences of challenging a king. What followed was not an act of impulsiveness, but one of pure, calculated might. He strode into the grand hall where the court was still assembled. For their evening repast, Lira at his side. His sudden entrance precipitated an immediate, hushed silence. He did not occupy his throne. Instead, he stood in the center of the hall, a commanding presence that commanded every eye. There have been whispers, Rowan began, his voice echoing off the lofty stone ceilings, each word sharp and as clear as ice. Whispers of dissent, and fueled by the falsehoods of a jealous and dishonorable wolf. He let his gaze sweep across the assembled nobles, daring any of them to avert their eyes. Allow me to put these whispers to rest. He raised Lira's hand, the one that had held the note, and intertwined his fingers with hers. Her hand felt small within his, yet it seemed to represent the anchor of his entire existence. This is Elra of the House of Rowan, my destined mate, your future queen. His voice deepened, but its power did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. Our culminating ceremony of designation, a pact destined to be acknowledged by the very stars and this entire realm, shall be conducted on the ensuing cycle of the full moon. A unified intake of breath swept through the grand assembly. This was far more than a simple announcement. It was a defiant declaration of hostilities. Her pronouncement is my command, Rowan proclaimed, his voice escalating into a resonant decree of unassailable authority. Her reputation is my own, and any soul who presumes to contest her standing contests me. From this precise moment forward, any utterance against her shall be construed as an act of sedition. He allowed the chilling implication to permeate the atmosphere, a looming peril poised above every head. He had unequivocally drawn a boundary, visible to the entire world. Cale intended to engage in a clandestine struggle of subtlety and deception. Rowan, in contrast, had just illuminated every corner. As the news of this royal decree spread with astounding rapidity, he was certain it would reach Cale by the morrow, and he knew with a chilling certainty that a predator, deprived of the ability to prevail through discourse, would inevitably resort to its primal instincts. In the intervening weeks, the castle was abuzz with preparations for the ceremony. Lira found herself immersed in a whirlwind of attire fittings and lessons in courtly decorum. Rowan, true to his pledge, commenced the gradual process of familiarizing her with her impending responsibilities. He began escorting her on brief official excursions into the city that sprawled beneath the castle's shadow, desiring the populace to perceive her not as an ethereal legend, but as their sovereign. It was during one of these outings that their meticulously constructed reality began to crumble. They were traversing a vibrant marketplace. The air was perfumed with the aroma of exotic spices and freshly baked bread. For the first time, Elra experienced a nascent sense of peace. The common folk were unlike the aristocracy. They offered her smiles of unfeigned curiosity, devoid of any veiled disdain. She was just beginning to entertain the possibility that she might, indeed, be capable of fulfilling this role. That was when she perceived it, a subtle, unnatural shift within the throng. A man, his features concealed by the shadow of a low-brimmed hood, was pushing his way forward with an almost frantic urgency. Her breath hitched. Time seemed to decelerate, stretching into an almost infinite duration. She glimpsed the gleam of metal in his hand, a wickedly crafted dagger. Its blade was coated in a substance that shimmered with an unwholesome green luminescence. Silver venom, intended for an alpha. Was it meant for Rowan? No. The trajectory was clearly aimed at her. Before she could vocalize a warning, before the thought could fully register, Rowan reacted. He was an instantaneous blur of motion, an elemental force. He exhibited no hesitation. He did not deliberate. He simply responded, his body a living bulwark. With a single, potent sweep of his arm, he propelled her behind him, whirling to confront the assailant. The attacker was swift, but Rowan was swifter. He managed to deflect the man's striking arm, though not entirely. The poisoned blade, meant for her heart, carved a deep, savage wound across Rowan's forearm. A guttural roar of raw, untamed fury erupted from Rowan's throat as his guards converged on the assassin, subduing him on the cobblestone. The marketplace dissolved into pandemonium, shrieks and shouts reverberating off the stone edifices. Yet Lira registered none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to a single, horrifying image: the dark, viscous blood seeping from the laceration on Rowan's arm. His blood, shed for her. The terror that had gripped her was instantaneously supplanted. It was replaced by a searing, incandescent rage she had never before experienced. This was no longer about subtle maneuvering. This was no longer about her past. This was about the man, the king, who had just placed himself in the path of a venomous blade to preserve her existence. Without conscious thought, she tore a lengthy strip from the silken hem of her own opulent gown. She pushed past the circle of stunned guards and dropped to her knees beside Rowan, applying firm pressure with the fabric to the wound. "Remain still," she commanded, her voice no longer the submissive murmur of an omega, but the sharp, resolute directive of a woman fiercely defending what she refused to relinquish. As he gazed down at her, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of pain and astonishment, he was not beholding a terrified maiden. He was witnessing a queen, her countenance pallid, but her eyes blazing with the fierce, protective ardor of a wolf guarding its mate. The assault, intended to extinguish her life and shatter their shared future, had instead transmuted her apprehension into an instrument of power. Pain was a familiar companion, yet this was different. This was debility. The silver poison did not manifest as a searing inferno, but as a frigid, pervasive miasma coursing through his veins, draining the vitality from his sinews and rendering his bones as heavy as lead. His renowned alpha regenerative capabilities, which could typically mend flesh and knit bone within mere hours, were reduced to a maddeningly sluggish pace. He sat at the edge of his bed, the sheer effort of maintaining an upright posture a Herculean task, and listened as his dominion began to unravel. Valeria stood before him, his visage a mask of solemn obligation. Yet Rowan could discern the thinly veiled disquiet in his old comrade's eyes. "The assassin was a diversion, Your Majesty," Valeria stated, his voice devoid of inflection, as if the very words were weighted with dread. "A brilliant, brutal gambit. While our focus was on the marketplace, Cale made his move." Rowan surveyed his bandaged limb, the simple white linen a stark symbol of his capitulation. "The Silver Moon Pack," Valeria confirmed, his voice heavy. "He has seized it. The Elder Alpha is deceased." Cale, Valeria explained, had issued a challenge, asserting that the Alpha was too infirm to safeguard the pack from a despotic monarch. He spat the words with palpable disgust. "He eradicated those loyal to you and declared himself Alpha. The assassination attempt served as his testament that you are incapable of protecting even your own mate within your own city." A growl, feeble yet imbued with potent malice, rumbled in Rowan's chest. He had perceived Cale as a scorned former companion, a mere political inconvenience. He had failed to recognize him as a regicide, a warlord. He had fundamentally underestimated him. And now, the repercussions of that oversight were being paid in bloodshed. "And the situation escalates," Valeria added, his voice descending even lower. "The renegade factions that have been harassing our frontiers for months were not acting independently. Cale was their benefactor, their commander. He has incorporated them into his forces. He now commands a legion of zealots, traitors, and savages." The fragmented pieces of the puzzle coalesced with a chillingly precise clarity. This had been Cale's master plan all along. The rejection, the insidious whispers, the orchestrated attack, all were meticulously calculated stages in his ascent to power, and Lira Elra had merely been the catalyst he needed to ignite the conflagration. As if summoned by an unseen hand, a royal courier, his face ashen and beaded with sweat, hastened into the chamber and knelt. He extended a scroll sealed not with wax, but with a crude imprint of dried blood. Rowan took it, his fingers feeling unnervingly clumsy and sluggish. He broke the seal. Cale's script was a jagged, presumptuous scrawl. It was not a plea. It was an unequivocal ultimatum. "Surrender the Omega. Present me with Elra, and I shall permit your people to live. Refuse, and my legions will raise a path to your opulent citadel and claim her from your lifeless form." Rowan crushed the parchment within his fist. He yearned to rise, to unleash a roar, to lead his armies and grind Cale's bones to dust, but as he attempted to stand, his legs faltered, and a wave of vertigo compelled him back onto the bed. He was a monarch imprisoned within a failing physique, a wolf ensnared within the confines of his own mortal shell. And beyond his walls, a rival was amassing an army to abduct his beloved and reduce his world to ashes. She spent her days by his bedside, a silent, impotent observer of his arduous struggle. She changed his dressings, offered him broths he barely consumed, and witnessed the internal battle of frustration and fury raging within his golden eyes. Each time he clenched his jaw against the pain, she felt it as if a blade had pierced her own vit affection. A profound, gnawing guilt had taken root within her soul, a noxious weed entwining itself around her heart. This was her doing, all of it. That evening, seeking a moment of respite, she wandered through the castle's corridors. Yet there was no escape. The air, once vibrant with the confident hum of a secure realm, was now thick with an impalpable undercurrent of tension. Guards conversed in hushed, urgent tones. Servants hurried past, their eyes wide with apprehension. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. As she passed the open doorway of the war chamber, she overheard voices emanating from within. Valeria and another of Rowan's senior commanders. She paused, concealed within the enveloping shadows. His strength is recuperating, but far too slowly, the commander stated, his voice laden with concern. Cale's forces have already secured the northern pass. They will reach the river by the week's end. The king is cognizant of this, Valeria's voice rumbled. He is exerting himself excessively. He has become compromised, the commander asserted, not with malevolence, but with the cold, unyielding pragmatism of a seasoned soldier. His heart has become his gravest vulnerability. This war, all of it, stems from a single omega. A monarch cannot afford such a susceptibility. The word struck her with the impact of a physical blow, a single omega, a vulnerability. Her fundamental self-doubt, the very core belief she thought she had begun to overcome, the one that whispered she was an inconsequential burden, resurfaced with suffocating intensity. They were correct. Before her arrival, there had been tranquility. Rowan had been an insurmountable, unyielding force, and now he was injured. His kingdom teetered on the precipice of a brutal conflict, and his most trusted confidants perceived her as the instigator. She retreated from the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth to suppress a sob. She stumbled through the halls until she found herself before the immense map displayed in the main gallery. Cale's encroaching forces were marked with stark, crimson banners, a relentless tide of aggression steadily advancing towards them. She gazed at the map, but she did not perceive armies or territories. She saw a wound inflicted upon the face of the world, a wound she had caused. Cale's fixation, Rowan's injury, the palpable fear in the eyes of the castle's inhabitants, it all traced back to her. She was not a queen. She was a pestilence. She walked to his chambers, her steps moving as if caught in a dream. Her decision felt like a shard of ice piercing her chest, cold, sharp, and absolute. This was the only conceivable path. She found him standing, leaning heavily against a table, his gaze fixed upon the darkening sky outside the window. He was attired, yet he appeared pallid and gaunt, a mere shadow of the formidable monarch he was destined to be. He turned as she entered, a faint, weary smile gracing his lips. "Lira, please," she whispered, her voice faltering. She could not bear his gentle demeanor. "Not now." She halted in the center of the room, compelling herself to meet his gaze. She had to do this for him, for his kingdom. "I must depart, Rowan," she stated, the words tasting like ashes on her tongue. "He desires only me, Cale. This war, it is all because of my presence. If I surrender myself to him, it will cease." His smile vanished, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. "Lira, no. You do not comprehend the gravity of your words." "I understand perfectly," she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. I witness their gazes. I hear their whispers. Your own men consider me a liability, and they are correct. Observe yourself. You are wounded. Your kingdom is imperiled, and I am the sole reason." She took a shaky breath, preparing to deliver the final, devastating blow. This would inflict more pain than Cale's rejection, more than any physical wound, for this time the words emanated from her own being. I release you from our bond," she choked out, fabricating the agony of physical severance. "I release you from the mark. I am not your queen. I am not your mate." This was it, her nadir. She was confronting her deepest dread, the conviction of her own worthlessness, by wholeheartedly embracing it. She endeavored to demonstrate her affection by articulating her own inadequacy, believing that her absence was the most profound gift she could bestow upon him. This was not an act of fleeing in terror. This was a noble sacrifice, a self-immolation upon the altar of her own culpability. She gazed at his strong, exquisite features, imprinting every line, every shadow upon her memory. "A kingdom requires a robust sovereign," she murmured, her heart fracturing into a million pieces, "not one weakened by a broken omega." Without awaiting a response, she turned and proceeded towards the door. Each step felt like an eternity. She did not look back. If she were to glance backward, she would shatter, and she had to do this. She had to shield him from herself. She turned away, and a chilling void of absolute frigidity descended upon his soul, a frigidity entirely unrelated to the poison coursing through his veins. The sight of her advancing towards that portal, her back erect, her shoulders burdened by the weight of a feigned noble sacrifice, was a blade twisting within his core. Should she pass through that threshold, Cale would triumph, not through his legions, but by proving that Rowan was incapable of safeguarding even his own mate's heart. No, he would not permit such an outcome. With a surge of will that felt as if it were tearing his very muscles from his bones, he pushed himself away from the table. His legs trembled, yet they bore his weight. He crossed the room in 3 long, unsteady strides, his hand closing on the door and propelling it shut just as she reached for the handle. The resounding thud of the heavy oak echoed in the sudden, charged silence. She froze, her back to him. "You will not," he stated, his voice a raw, ragged command. He rested his forehead against the cool wood of the door, his body screaming in protest. "You will not perpetrate this." "I must," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It is the sole means of your salvation." "Save me?" A harsh, humorless chuckle escaped him. He reached out, his hand settling with deliberate gentleness on her shoulder. She was quivering like a sapling in a tempest. "Lira, your departure would be the singular act that would truly break me. Cale's armies can shatter my bones. His venom can drain my strength, but you walking away would obliterate my spirit." She still refused to turn. He could sense the internal conflict raging within her. "Before you arrived," he continued, his voice deepening, becoming more tender, more vulnerable than he had ever allowed it to be with anyone. "This castle was a sepulchre. I was a ruler of phantoms. I possessed power. I presided over a realm, and I was utterly, profoundly solitary." He felt the resonance of the heartwood pass between them, the shared echo of his desolate isolation. "You did not bring war to my doorstep, Lira. You breathed life back into this hollow vessel of a man. You are not a burden. You are the very essence of my existence. My love for you is the sole genuine strength that remains within me." He gently turned her to face him. Her countenance was a mosaic of tears, her eyes wide with a beautiful, heartbreaking bewilderment. He looked directly into them, willing her to perceive the truth. "Your heart is not a failing," he declared, his voice resonant with unwavering conviction. "It is a formidable weapon. It is the strength this kingdom has lacked for a century. I am a warrior, Lira. I can command legions. I can repel sieges, but only you. Only you possess the ability to win over the hearts of the populace." Her breath hitched, her tears abated. He could perceive the gears turning behind her eyes, his words penetrating, finding purchase within the fissures of her self-contempt. She was not an encumbrance. She represented a different form of power, a different caliber of queen, the nascent spark of an idea, a flicker of renewed hope ignited in the depths of her gaze. She looked up at him. The last vestiges of her despair receded, washed away by a dawning, new illumination. "The people," she whispered, as if savoring the word for the very first time. The following morning, she entered the war chamber. The space was filled with stern-faced commanders and the pervasive, tense aroma of ancient maps and palpable fear. Every head in the room turned towards her as she entered, their expressions ranging from startled surprise to thinly veiled disapproval. Rowan was present, seated at the head of the table. He was still pale, but a new light gleamed in his eyes as he observed her. He had rescued her from herself. Now it was her turn to safeguard his realm. "We cannot achieve victory through a direct confrontation without incurring devastating casualties," one of the commanders stated, gesturing towards the map. "Kale commands superior numbers and possesses the advantage of terrain." "He holds the numerical superiority," Lira interjected, her voice quiet yet distinct. Every gaze in the room snapped towards her. "But he does not possess their hearts." She approached the table, her hands resting flat upon the cool, worn surface. She focused her attention not on Rowan, but on his assembled officers. "I am acquainted with the Silver Moon warriors," she declared, her voice gaining strength with each passing word. "They are not murderers or savages. They are a proud people. They followed Kale because he perpetuated a fabrication of a stolen mate and a tyrannical sovereign." "They fight for a falsehood," Valeria grunted. "A falsehood for which they appear exceedingly willing to perish, my lady." "Then we must provide them with a truth worth living for," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Your strategy is to confront his army with your own. Steel against steel, culminating in a bloodbath. However, I propose an alternative plan." The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. She took a deep breath. "Arrange a parley on neutral territory, but not between two alphas. It shall be between myself and my former pack." A ripple of disbelief coursed through the assembled commanders. "That is tantamount to suicide," one exclaimed. "He will eliminate you on sight." "He will not," Lira stated with chilling certainty. "Because his entire claim rests upon the premise that he is fighting on my behalf. To assassinate me in the presence of both armies would be to confess his duplicity, and he is far too arrogant for that." She met Rowan's gaze. "I shall not speak of treaties or capitulation. I shall speak to them of their homeland. I shall remind them that Kale has forged an alliance with the very lawless brigands who have been bleeding our borders for months. I shall leverage their pride, not as a weapon against us, but as a weapon against him." She could discern the skepticism evident on their faces. It was a reckless, desperate gambit, and Omega's bold wager. But then Rowan spoke, his voice leaving no room for dissent. "You shall have your parley," he proclaimed, his golden eyes locking with hers. He rose, his presence commanding the room despite his injury. "I will bring my army to the field. We shall serve as the blade at your back. But you, my queen, you shall be the voice at the forefront." His unwavering faith in her was a warm, steadying influence, dispelling the last vestiges of her apprehension. She was no longer a victim of this conflict. She was the orchestrator of its conclusion. The morning designated for the parley dawned cold and overcast, the sky resembling the hue of aged steel. Rowan rode at the vanguard of his army, the most formidable fighting force in the known world, a torrent of silent, disciplined power flowing in his wake. Yet, for the first time in his existence, he was not leading it in solitude. At his side, mounted upon a spirited white mare, rode Lira. She was not the trembling Omega he had discovered in the wilderness. She was not the frightened girl who had recoiled from his touch. Today, she embodied the queen in every aspect. She was clad in simple, dark riding attire, both practical and elegant. Her dark tresses were braided back from a face that, though pale, radiated an unyielding resolve. Her posture was erect, her chin held high, and her gaze was fixed upon the distant horizon. He watched her, a profound, heart-stopping wave of pride swelling within his chest. He remained weakened. The lingering poison was a dull, constant ache in his arm, a stark reminder of how perilously close he had come to losing her. But riding beside her now, he had never felt more potent. His army represented the tangible manifestation of his power, 1,000 sharp talons and fangs poised to rend and tear. However, all of that might was now dedicated to supporting her strategy, to embodying her wisdom. His sword was now subservient to her spirit. The tension in the air was so palpable he could almost taste it, the metallic tang of unsheathed steel and unspoken fear. Every one of his soldiers considered this an ill-advised venture, a lamb being led to slaughter. Yet they followed because he, their king, had commanded it, and he had issued that command because he possessed absolute faith in the woman beside him. They crested the final incline, and the valley designated for the parley unfolded before them. On the far side, a dark mass of warriors awaited, a discordant, undisciplined host, a melange of the distinguished silver moon banner and the tattered, blood-stained emblems of the renegade clans. And at their head, a single figure sat astride a formidable black warhorse, Kale. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of their adversaries, Lira turned to him. There was no trace of fear in her eyes, only a calm, steady determination that rendered him breathless. She was prepared. The wind howled a solitary lament across the valley, whipping stray strands of hair across her face. It was cold, so profoundly cold. Across the barren expanse of grass, Kale was seated upon his warhorse, a statue of black iron embodying sheer arrogance. He was smirking. She had anticipated that reaction. He did not address her directly. Instead, he amplified his voice, pitching it to carry across the field towards Rowan. "King Rowan," he bellowed, "have you finally come to your senses? Relinquish the Omega, and you may retreat to your stronghold with your life intact." Elara offered no deliberation to Rowan's unspoken response. With a singular, silent vow in her gaze, she dismounted her steed. Her footwear yielded to the yielding earth as she proceeded onward, unaccompanied. Every sentinel of both encampments observed her solitary advance, a solitary diminutive form traversing the no-man's land, dividing two poised legions. Her heart throbbed against her ribcage with the frantic rhythm of fear mingled with unwavering resolve. Yet her gait remained unswerving. She was no longer in flight. She halted at the very center of the expanse and turned, not toward Kale, but towards the host of the Silver Moon Pack, towards the sentinels with whom her youth was intertwined. She discerned their countenances, bewildered, incensed, unsure. "I am Lira," she proclaimed. Her voice, no longer the hesitant murmur of an Omega, but the resonant clarion of a sovereign. It carried upon the zephyr, reaching each individual. "I perceive you. I recognize the progeny of Torvin and the sibling of Ara. I recall our shared pursuits in these woodlands, alongside your progenitors. I remember the mending of your training garments." A spark of recognition ignited, a subtle shifting of stances. She had captured their collective focus. "You were appalled that this conflict was initiated for my honor," she continued, her voice gaining fortitude. "You were apprised of my abduction. This is a fabrication." Her gaze traversed them, connecting with as many eyes as possible. "Yet, a more insidious deception has been perpetrated. You have been bartered. Observe your left and your right. Who stands adjacent to you within your formations?" She paused, permitting them to observe, to witness the disheveled, wild-eyed vagabonds interspersed amongst their own dignified champions. "You behold the very lupines who plundered our frontiers, the perpetrators of our patrol's demise, and the pilferers of our sustenance, those who cornered me within the sylvan expanse on that fateful night." Her voice ascended, infused with a righteous indignation they could comprehend. "Kale did not extricate me from their clutches. He has ushered them into our sanctuary. He brokered a pact with our adversaries to usurp authority. He is not your liberator. He is your betrayer." The verity unfolded in the crisp morning air. Doubt, akin to a rapidly propagating contagion, permeated the ranks of the silver moon. She perceived it in the way they regarded one another, then the vagabonds beside them, and finally, Cale. His visage was a tableau of unadulterated homicidal fury. He had forfeited their allegiance. She had divested him of them with naught but the truth. "You utter falsehoods!" he bellowed, his voice fracturing with wrath. He urged his mount forward, not at Rowan, but at her. A blur of black malevolence, his blade unsheathed and glinting in the pallid, gray luminescence. He assailed. Time fragmented. A streak of black and silver, pure force, intercepted him. Rowan. He met Cale's charge, his own rapier a phantom. The percussive clash of steel upon steel, a deafening shriek. But it was Lira who brought it to a halt. "No further," she commanded, her voice cleaving through the din of combat. The authority inherent in that solitary utterance was absolute. Both Rowan and Cale froze. "This shall not conclude with additional bloodshed." She advanced towards Cale, who panted, his eyes ablaze with animosity. She stopped just beyond the reach of his blade and regarded the man who had shattered her existence, and she felt naught, neither trepidation nor animosity, merely a profound, tranquil pity. "You desired preeminence," she stated, her voice serene and unwavering. "You coveted a throne. You sought veneration." She inclined her head gently. "Yet, your entire existence was constructed upon a falsehood. You were accurate on one particular point, Cale. The destinies do not align a lion with a mouse. They pair them with a lioness." She met his gaze, and he beheld the sovereign within her eyes. With a singular gesture toward Valerius, she issued the directive. "Seize him." Before Cale could react, Rowan's guards encircled him, dislodging him from his mount. She averted her gaze from him. "Exile him. Allow him to traverse the untamed territories, as the vagabonds do." She glanced at him one final time over her shoulder. "Now, you shall possess nothing." Rowan observed, his heart a thunderous percussion within his chest, his entire being suffused with a sentiment so profound, so overwhelming. It transcended mere pride. It was reverence. She had confronted an army. She had disarmed them with her valor and her spirit. She had vanquished her tormentor, not by descending to his level of barbarity, but by ascending above it with the grace and judgment befitting a queen. As Cale was conveyed away, vociferating imprecations that were already beginning to sound pitiable and hollow, a profound quietude descended upon the valley. The silver moon warriors stood in stunned silence, their armaments hanging loosely at their flanks. They appeared adrift. Their alpha was a traitor, their cause a fabrication. Then, one warrior, a broad-shouldered man Rowan recognized as the commander of their patrols, relinquished his blade. It descended into the verdure with a soft thud. He advanced, his gaze fixed upon Lira. He halted a few paces from her and slowly, deliberately, knelt upon one knee. He bowed his head. "My queen," he uttered, his voice thick with emotion. As if a barrier had collapsed, a cascade of movement ensued. Another warrior knelt, then 3 more, then a dozen. Within the span of a breath, the entire silver moon contingent was prostrate upon the sodden field. They were not offering obeisance to him, the triumphant monarch. They were bending the knee to her, their Luna Queen, the Omega, who had just liberated them from their own misguided conviction. He approached her side, his own soul aching with a devotion so potent it felt like a tangible presence. He was the most formidable alpha extant. Yet, in that moment, he comprehended that the paramount strength within the valley resided in the diminutive, resolute woman standing beside him. The conflict had concluded, and she had emerged victorious. He extended his hand and clasped hers, his fingers intertwining with hers. Her hand remained steady within his. It was no longer the hand of a victim, it was the hand of a partner, a sovereign. He surveyed the kneeling multitude and then gazed down at her. Together they would reconstruct. Together they would mend the lacerations this discord had inflicted upon the core of his dominion. Weeks later, the grand hall no longer resonated with trepidation. Tonight, it served as a sanctuary of jubilation, filled to capacity with the dignitaries and nobles of the entire realm. The atmosphere was balmy, perfumed with wine and roasted herbs, and enveloped by the contented murmur of a realm at peace. Lira stood adjacent to Rowan, not behind him before the imposing throne. She was attired in a gown of starlit silver, the hue of the royal lineage. Yet it was not the raiment that conferred her strength. It was the placid self-assurance that had become deeply ingrained within her. She met the gazes of the court, and this time she perceived not censure, but genuine admiration. Awe. Her eyes drifted towards the soaring arches at the hall's far end. For a fleeting instant, she observed a shadow detach itself from the throng, a solitary, gaunt figure, Cale. He had been permitted to witness this solitary moment, the concluding stipulation of his banishment, before vanishing into the wild expanses eternally. He was a specter at the festivity, a memento of a past that no longer held sway over her. As swiftly as he materialized, he was gone. Rowan turned towards her, and the entirety of the hall seemed to recede. There existed no other entity in the cosmos but him. His golden irises were not those of a monarch claiming a prize. They were the eyes of a man beholding his entire universe. "The inaugural mark was for destiny," he murmured, his voice so subdued only she could apprehend it. "This one. This is for me. This is for you. This is for us." He lowered his head, and his lips grazed the skin of her throat, precisely over the faint, silvery impression of the initial mark. This instance, there was no surge of startling enchantment, no violent appropriation. There was merely an unparalleled, soul-deep warmth that permeated her, a gentle and deliberate pledge. As he imprinted her, the crest bloomed to life, not with the fierce, possessive luminescence of their prior union, but with a soft, steadfast, and perpetual radiance. It was not a brand of dominion. It was a covenant. Her world underwent a subtle shift, not through shock, but with a profound sense of rectitude. The fractured fragments of her spirit had not merely been repaired, they had been reforged into something more resilient, something more exquisite. He raised his head, and his hand found hers. Together they turned to face their populace, a king and his queen. The mark upon her throat glowed softly, a beacon of illumination and affection at the heart of the kingdom. She was no longer the repudiated Omega or the commandeered bride. She was home.